America is shaped by the movement of people from across the country and around the world, in our history and our future. From north, south, east, and west, artists and thinkers are bringing new perspectives to our stories of belonging, migration, and America's legacy. Through artwork and conversation, we can understand where we come from and what weaves us together, and envision what can become of us.
Funding for this program was provided by the Stanford Institute for Advancing Just Societies.
My name is Moira Shourie, and I'm the Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square. Let me tell you about tonight's program, the premiere of Durga's Daughters, an original performance created and directed by Indian American choreographer and dancer Mythili Prakash. A second-generation Indian and American artist, Mythili Prakash is trained by her mother, a renowned teacher, Vijay Prakash. Mythili has presented solo productions across the United States, Mexico, Canada, and the United Kingdom, Europe, India, and Singapore. Mythili has received grants from her work from the Irvine Dance Foundation and the Center for Cultural Innovation. And she is a 2024 United States Artists Fellow. It's an honor to present Mythili Prakash and the premiere of her new work, Durga's Daughters.
I want to write is usually a story of blood and war. But the story I'm going to tell is a story of love. Da, 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 da. But wait, it's not that kind of love story. Love is many things, you know. So in my mind, it was a story of love. They say she was born to kill. Fire of destruction filled her being. Each hand held a different weapon. Each hand held a different weapon. But those weapons weren't hers. What was hers was love. Unblemished, tender, unconditional love. She didn't see someone who was meant to be killed. She saw a being who was misunderstood, who was beautiful and kind with stars in his eyes. Someone who had been hurt and rejected, left alone. Someone who just wanted to be loved and seen. And in that, she saw herself. She wasn't a blood-devouring warrior.
She was a blood-devouring warrior.
She wasn't an agent of destruction born to vanquish.
She was an agent of destruction born to vanquish.
Yes,
she
was born of fire. She was built of fire.
She was built of fire.
But does fire not flicker?
Fire is strong.
Do you think maybe fire feels the struggle?
Fire destroys.
Between the wood that feeds it and the air that consumes it?
Fire consumes.
Maybe that's why fire is so dynamic.
Fire
always
is
moving,
powerful.
never still. Do you think fire is vulnerable?
Fire is powerful.
And sometimes just wants to be quenched.
Fire is not weak.
And disappear into the coolness of a water drop.
Fire is strong.
Certainly, there is such a thing as fire of passion.
Fire is not weak.
But could
Fire
there be
is strong.
such a thing as fire of compassion?
Fire is not weak.
So let's take a step back. Let's say she did feel passion. People think it was a passion to kill, but I know another story, and that is the story I want to tell. She was a mother of 2 daughters. Daughters born from her fire. Daughters she had to leave to fulfill her duty. What if I told you that troubled her? That she didn't want to leave them?
It is day 4 of the raids. As devotees gather in different parts of the city to celebrate the Hindu festival Navaratri, many question if all religious and cultural activities should come to a halt during this period. The festivities are expressions of faith, a time of prayer and a celebration of good over evil through the goddess Durga's triumph over the demon Mahisha, or so the legend says. While the city has always celebrated migrant culture, the question remains, are these festivities simply a trap?
Jai Ma, some flowers and kumkum.
Namaste to all of those who have gathered here to celebrate this auspicious occasion of Navaratri. It's a time to be careful, no doubt, but Tam Agnivarnam Tapasa Jvalantim Vairochanim Karma Bhaleshu Juktaam Durgam Devim Sharanamaham Prapadye Sutarasitarase Namaha.
Saris, we gotta go now.
No, we just got
No,
here.
I don't care. We have to leave.
Leave where? It's safer
No, but
in the bunker. Trust me.
Our Ma is here to protect us. Have faith in her mercy and grace. We will start with the names of Durga. Shri, auspicious. Om
Shriye Namaha. Are you feeling okay?
Am I feeling okay? No, I'm not feeling okay. Do you understand the gravity of what's happening right now?
Of course I do.
No, but do you? Like, this is insane what's happening right now. We should not have been at that puja.
No, Laksh. The government is trying to instill fear in us like this. As if we don't deserve to be here.
Technically, we don't. Saras, we are not like the other people. We are not even from this world. Have you even thought for 1 second what would happen if we got caught? We've been lucky beyond belief that we've been blessed with these jobs and these lives through God. I don't even know what.
Grace. Laksh, through grace. Sometimes I feel you forget who we are. We're not ordinary.
Once upon a time, there was a young boy who was born in the forest to a wild mother buffalo. She was gentle and kind. One day, Mother was struck by a hunter's arrow. In her last moments, she held her boy close. There is much beyond this forest. Do not stop until you find your magic. The young boy buffalo was heartbroken. One day, the young boy overheard the birds singing of a magical place in the clouds where all wishes came true. With stars in his eyes, he set off for the long, winding road that disappeared into the clouds. After a long journey, he finally arrived at the gates of this magical land. Stop. Who do you think you are? Asked the guards. You're not allowed here. The guards laughed at him. Not for a buffalo boy like you.
The issuance of visas to any place where adequate screening cannot occur.
Tears filled the boy's eyes.
After federal agents conducted an immigration operation,
I just wish people could see that I am a child too. He thought of his mother's words.
That a large-scale federal immigration operation was carried out. No one was arrested that day, but the images of military vehicles, officers on horseback...
Do not stop until you find your magic. He shut his eyes and said these words again and again and again. When he opened his eyes, the gates were wide open. The guards stared in disbelief and fear as the buffalo boy entered their magical land. They ran after him, shouting, catch him, he doesn't belong here." Chaos ensued in this magical land. The buffalo boy will destroy everything. Get him out. Call her, only she can catch him.
Impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful, impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful. I am going to create a new special beautification identify beautiful and quickly removing the most dangerous criminal illegal immigrants in America who have evaded justice. Beautiful, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful, physical, tall, powerful.
Stop! What was that? I don't know if I understand the truth or not, but for the first time I feel it. There's a knowing that Ma brought us here to discover who we are. To know that human and divine aren't separate, and beyond that, I don't know how to put it into words, but I get it. I'm on board.
Wait.
Yeah. Whatever madness you're up to, I get it. I'm on board.
So you're not worried we're gonna get caught?
Well, you gotta have belief, right? Okay, we only have an hour, let's go.
It would be too easy to end Lakshmi and Saraswati stories there. Where they continue is within us. After all, aren't we all Durga's daughters? Carrying the baggage of our past, our traditions and legacies, and trying to make sense of how they sit within us today. Aren't we both human and divine, seeking the inner abundance that does not run in the same currency of this outer world? Struggling to find balance between action and surrender, between magic and science, between machine and spirit. More and more, we believe what we see, but somewhere we also see what we believe. And that's what makes all these stories we tell. Belief. There is no one truth, no one story. And that is why this is the story that I want to tell.
And now I'm going to introduce our panel's moderator. Tomás Jiménez is a professor of sociology here at Stanford and the founding co-director of Stanford's Institute for Advancing Just Societies. His research and writing focus on immigration, policy, integration, social mobility, and ethnic and racial identity. Over to you, Tomás.
It is my pleasure to now introduce our three panelists. Ahmed Badr is an Iraqi-American author, professor, and social entrepreneur. Ahmed is author of While the Earth Sleeps, We Travel, and he's also founder of Naratio, which runs signature fellowship programs for resettled refugee youth in partnership with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His work sits at the intersection of storytelling, migration, and venture creation. Julian Brave NoiseCat is a writer and filmmaker. His documentary, Sugarcane, directed with Emily Cassie, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Directing Award in the U.S. documentary competition. A member of the Canham Lake Band, NoiseCat's first book, We Survive the Night, is a national bestseller. Dr. Janina Jeff Ringo is a population geneticist, educator, motivational speaker, STEAM advocate, and award-winning podcaster. She's the host and executive producer of In Those Genes, a podcast that uses genetics to decode the lost histories of African-descended Americans through the lens of Black culture. I, in many ways, want to pick up where the performance left off. So we're going to be talking somewhat interchangeably about legacy and storytelling. And I think of storytelling as a way of curating, of passing along, potentially suppressing legacy. So with that preface, I want to get into it. And Julian, I want to throw this first question at you. When I think of legacy, I think of inheritance. And we all inherit various kinds of legacies because of when we were born, the circumstances we were born into, where we were born. And so to pick up the question that animates our panel, how do we dance with the legacies that we inherit?
Firstly, thank you all so much for sticking around. I myself am a dancer. I'm no Mythili Prakash, just to be clear. But I have spent my life on the powwow circuit, which is a big part of indigenous life in North America. It's basically type of gathering of song and dance. Some of them are competitive, and in fact, the largest one in Northern California is held on this campus at Stanford on Mother's Day weekend. A number of you are nodding your heads because you know what I'm talking about. And that was a big gathering in the community that I grew up in, because I also grew up across the bay in Oakland, California. And the reason that I became a powwow dancer is actually, I think, kind of gets at the question that you're asking. I grew up in a, household where I was a child of two different worlds. My dad was, this is kind of a contradiction in terms, but my dad was a famous Indian artist, to the extent that there is such things as famous Indian artists, because Indian artists don't usually get to be famous. But I remember when he was pictured on the cover of Native People's magazine with a backwards Kangol hat and purple rock star shades. Like he truly was a character. And my mom's an Irish-Jewish New Yorker, so when she talks, you can really hear it. And my dad, he left when I was young, and so I was raised by my white mom. And for those who can't see, who are visually impaired, I'm a brown man with long hair, and also they put about as Indian a name as you could on a kid, Julian Brave NoiseCat. Nobody read that at school attendance, and it was like, "What's your ethnic background?" So, there I was with a white mom in Oakland, California, and a dad who was in the wind. And a big way that I connected with my indigeneity, with my heritage, was I went to powwow drum and dance practice at the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, California on International Boulevard. It's the third oldest urban Indian community center in the United States. People don't know that, but actually the Bay Area has been home to urban natives for a long time because there was a federal relocation program. And so, the way that I was able to remain connected to my identity was through dancing. And what's interesting about the dances that I do is that they originate with the dances of the hunt and the war. And so essentially they're storytelling dances as well. And so essentially through dance, we are on the powwow circuit, following in the footsteps of our ancestors. That is kind of quite literally what the conception is. And of course, for all of us as Native people, myself included, it's not exactly the easiest thing to follow in the footsteps of ancestors. There were purposeful attempts to make that impossible, to make it illegal, and to kill off those very songs and dances and ways of being. And yet, so often, what's so interesting about the history of indigenous peoples in this country is that our political resurgence, the movement for self-determination, coincided with our cultural resurgence. And so often when we were reclaiming our rights as sovereign nations, we were also reclaiming our songs and dances. It's almost as though those two things are connected.
Ahmed or Janina, how do you dance with a legacy?
Yeah, for me, storytelling is tied to place and lack of permanence in a place. My family came to the U.S. as refugees in 2008 via Syria, but we're from Iraq. And storytelling was something that was always the thing that we carried with us from place to place. And we went from Baghdad to Aleppo to the coast of Syria to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is uncommon route. And then now home isn't in Houston, Texas, and I'm in New England. But when I think about legacy, I think about the space between place, memory, and people, and the relationship between those three over time. And for us, going from kind of place to place, our story of being from Iraq and having kind of the very, very rich tradition around poetry and around history was always present, at the dinner table and beyond. And starting in high school, I started to ask myself this question of, as a young person, as this Iraqi American Muslim refugee, which sounds like an oxymoron in multiple ways, what does it mean to share our own stories on our own terms? And that started to wrestle with that question, and it started with sharing my own story and realizing that I could one, share it, that there were people that were willing to listen to it, and then realize that I was quickly becoming this like go-to inspiring refugee at the UN and other places. And it's a privilege to do that to a point, but I wasn't interested in that anymore. And so for me, storytelling is agency, the kind of agency that you can exercise that inspires other people to take control of their own ability to share their own stories on their own terms.
Yes, so my story is very different. I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and when I think about dancing with legacy, I think about the legacy of my ancestors who I've had the privilege of getting to know. I'm very fortunate to have met all 8 of my great-grandparents, and a part of that is hearing the stories that they told me growing up, and then learning as I got older all of the stories they didn't tell me. Then becoming at the intersection of science, trying to disentangle, what was told to me versus what science says. And so it was this complex relationship of trying to appreciate the things that were told to me through storytelling, but also to try to understand more so the stories that weren't told to me. And as I got older, starting to think about why certain parts of our legacy were not told. So to give some examples, I'm very, very, very fortunate to be the third generation graduate, third generation college graduate and graduate studies, which is very unusual for a Black American family in segregated New Orleans. And I was always told a lot about that legacy, a lot about the academic legacy. And when I reflect on my ancestors, I realized that I was told this because education was a gateway. Education was proximity to white supremacy and thus proximity to survival. But I wasn't told the stories of how my great-grandfather was severely underpaid, although he was a director of a city campaign, or how my grandfather, who got a PhD, almost didn't get a PhD because of hurdles that were not under his control. Those were the stories that were not told, but those were the stories through my own experience that I learned about and began to appreciate long after those ancestors were gone. So when I think about how I am, dancing with legacy, it's always kind of this twofold of really thinking about the beauty and the mindset and consciousness of my ancestors and appreciating both the good and the bad, which maybe wasn't told to me to protect me. So.
Yeah, let's stick with that point. So each of you have talked about some version of leaving parts of a legacy buried and unearthing other parts. And Ahmed, you mentioned agency. So Janina, I want to kind of ask you an agency question. How do we decide which parts of a legacy to leave buried and which to unearth, especially when some of the often buried parts are painful, they're full of shame, they're full of sorrow? How do you make that decision?
I think it's a very personal decision. I talk a lot about this. I'm a geneticist, and I have never taken a commercial genetic ancestry test, and that is intentional. And one of the reasons being is because I know that my genome can tell me a painful story that I may not want to confront, a painful story that may not add value to how I identify myself. And while I know the truth behind some of the painful past, it's a personal decision on how I choose to engage in it. And being someone who speaks about genetics often, and particularly the intersection of genetics and race, I feel like I come from a big place of privilege when I reflect on my ancestors, for example, who did not talk about these things. So I think it's a privilege to, one, know about them, but also to be able to talk about them and not be re-victimized and so forth. So I've made some conscious decisions on things I want to know, things I don't want to know. And I think my deciding factor at least, is can I benefit from knowing? And if there isn't a benefit from knowing for me personally, I choose not to engage, even though, I know about it.
The piece about, is it a burden to share And then, is it a burden to find out? Is really interesting. My own parents, they were civil engineers in Baghdad for decades, and then came here and kind of went back to school and started all over again. And I was the first person in my family to be public about our story of displacement. In the house, we'd never really talked about it. It was like, okay, this is life, and we do this, and then we do that, and then it is what it is. And in 2017, I did a podcast for the UN on migration across the US, and I interviewed my parents for the first time, and my younger sister. And it was the first time that we spoke to each other in English for an extended period of time. English is not allowed in the house, just Arabic, which I'm really grateful for. And we talked about the journey of coming to the US, and kind of what happened that initially caused us to leave our home in Baghdad was bombed. I wasn't home, my parents were, my sister were, and everybody survived, thankfully. And to hear both my dad's kind of recollection and my mom's recollection and my sister's, who, my sister was 3 years old, so, she didn't remember too much, was really powerful, it was really emotional. But that was a very small part of the conversation. The conversation was, a lot of it was about what it was like for my parents when they graduated with civil engineering degrees and couldn't find jobs in the US to work at Walmart and Home Depot and still come home and smile and be happy. And I've always wanted to ask them, like, how do you do that? How do you do a 8-hour, 9-hour shift to come home and be okay? And they talked about that for the first time. And it wasn't because they weren't hiding that. It just was, resilience was more important than laying it all out. So there is a time and place, I think, for everything. But there's also, I think, power for things to remain buried. And it's not a clear, lay it all out or don't.
Yeah, the question of agency is a really interesting one. And, I think that as humans, we often assume that we are the primary agents of why stories come forward and why certain events unfold. And what was really interesting to me about Mythili's piece was that it was in part talking about forces greater than ourselves and their agency, perhaps the supernatural, the divine. And the reason I bring that up is that that's something that I think a lot about in my work. Sugarcane is a documentary about a system of religious colonization that was continent and global in scale. And what's interesting about that story is that I actually did not choose, it was not because I was like, I want to document this history that story came together. Actually what happened, and this is part of response to the question, was that my co-director, after the discovery of 215 potential unmarked graves at a school in Kamloops, British Columbia, Emily Cassie, she reached out to me and asked me if I'd be open to collaborating with her on a documentary. And, long story short, I knew that this was a heavy story for my family. I'd never worked in documentary before. I had to think about it. So she went out and found a First Nation that was going to begin its own investigation and secured access, packed bags, got tickets. 2 weeks later, when I got back to her and said, hey, about that documentary, I think I'd be open to collaborating with you. That's when she told me that the First Nation that she'd secured access to follow was the Williams Lake First Nation, and that they were beginning an investigation at St. Joseph's Mission, which was completely flooring to me because that was the moment when I told her that's the school that my family was taken away to and where, to the best of my knowledge, at the time my father was born. So just to press the point, Emily happened to choose the one school out of 139 across Canada that my family was taken away to and where my father was born to focus our documentary on, not knowing that that was my connection to the story. So I think sometimes, it's worth asking what are the agencies beyond ourselves and what kinds of storytelling traditions, usually non-Western, non-secular ones, get at those kinds of truths in our lives.
Janina and Ahmed, you both talked about, burying or unearthing kind of family legacy. Julian, you've kind of brought us into talking more about a story of a collective. And I wonder if the question, or if you'd answer the question differently if we think about it in a different register. So we can think about burying or unearthing family stories, and we might think of that in some ways as an individual decision. But what about when it's a collective legacy? What about when it's the legacy of a group, be that a tribe, an ethnic group, a nation. And here I'm thinking about the placards that were outside of George Washington's home until a few months ago that told the story of George Washington having been a slave owner, in addition to all of the other things that George Washington did. And so there's been an effort to kind of bury that legacy because it's a painful part of our history. Those placards are back up. But how do we think about this as a collective legacy and the kind of burying and unearthing question?
I think about this in so many different aspects. I really think this is why I give my hats off to creators and communicators, because there is a way of doing this to bring shared value within a community. And so when I think about this, I'm thinking, how can the next generation benefit from knowing this? And in my own family, there were certain things that were taught to me that I didn't realize was a part of that communal, of sharing of information that wasn't, I wouldn't say as straightforward, so I didn't know it was shameful then, but there was an education of survival and things like that is community-wide. So I feel like when we think about this, we really have to think carefully about how we communicate these stories. And there is a way, and we do this on the show, of communicating and sharing painful past in light. So it doesn't have to be traumatic. There were several years in media where we saw all these slave stories, and most people in my community were like, we're not, during the uprising and the help, and it was just a lot. I think that there is a way in which we can share the story of our lives that also share the story of the time. That doesn't have to be traumatic. That doesn't have to be something that we need to protect our children from. It's something that we should be sharing with them. And the more that we become transparent with them and teach them about the world, how it was and how it should be, then I think the better we make the entire community.
Just to add to that, I think there's the invitation to share a story is just as important oftentimes as the story that's told and how that invitation is made. We run this fellowship program for resettled refugee youth, and the first thing we always start with is that you're not here to share your displacement story. If that's something you want to do, welcome, but here are a list of kind of opportunities and exercises. And the central exercise for the past 8 years for all 90 fellows has been pick an object from this museum and rewrite the label of the object as a poem according to your own history and experience. And then you will perform that in the galleries at the end of the month, intensive. And there are very clear issues with encyclopedic museums and others that are, I could spend the whole panel talking about. But with the exercise, it's much more about here is a question that you yourself get to answer in whichever way you would like to. And for some folks, they do talk about the displacement story, and for some folks, it doesn't appear at all. It's more about memory and the memories they want to hold on to. So I think to answer your question, it's about the infrastructure that is activating those stories and the infrastructure that is sustaining them over time. And so part of it is logistics of how do you access these stories over time? If it is a placard that's removed, are there other ways that that story could still be told? And also, that story is one that's been told for hundreds of years. And so it's not as easy as just taking out a placard and assuming people are like, oh, wow, this guy actually was great. That's not how it works. So it's short-sighted to just take them out because it's not going to make that much of a difference. And so I think it's about the infrastructure that those stories are being delivered through as well.
Yeah, as a Native person, I think I'm very interested not just in collective remembering, but collective forgetting. And, one of the things that I thought a lot about in especially the directing of Sugarcane, but also in the writing of We Survived the Night, is the way that the memory of these schools, existed literally, physically all across Canada, all across the United States. There were 139 schools across Canada, 417, 3 times as many here in the United States, and touched many different organs and arms of society, In Canada, it was the law enforcement, the RCMP, that enforced the mandatory attendance at these schools. They'd go pick up the kids. My grandmother, my kia, was picked up on the back of a cattle truck and taken to the school. They were administered by the churches, by the Catholic Church, some of the biggest institutions in the entire world. They received credit from banks. There were documentaries, some archival footage of which we included in the film, that aired on the CBC, the national broadcaster. So at a certain point, when people said things, non-Native people said things like, "We had no idea," I kind of struggle with that one, because I'm like, well, in our film, there's an advertisement that played on televisions across the country to adopt Indian and Métis children. There was an ad on your TV where you could go adopt one of these kids, this was a national system that your church was involved in, your bank was loaning to it, At the same time, though, what's interesting about forgetting, I think particularly in racialized and colonial context when there's a lot of trauma involved, is that forgetting can also be a collective strategy for survival. And for my family, what was really interesting about this history and this story was that it was one that we did not talk about. My father was actually born at St. Joseph's Mission, the school that my family was sent to, and found in the trash incinerator in circumstances that were significant enough that they were reported in the local newspaper. And yet this was a story that he himself did not know and that our family never talked about, and didn't talk about what happened at the schools writ large. So there are ways in which that collective act of amnesia can also be internalized by the very people who survived the injustice, which I think is a really interesting thing, and I think points to the truth in some of the moves that many post-colonial theorists have made about the way that colonization ends up becoming internalized by the colonized subject.
Each of you, and Mythili as well, are telling stories of people who are often hidden. They're some of the most vulnerable people historically and in the here and now. And in doing so, you're answering a call for inclusion. And I want us to kind of consider for a second inclusion into what? So we can think of the stories that you tell or that you facilitate people telling as kind of individual threads. And they're threads to be appreciated on their own, and they should stand on their own, especially because these are often people who have been forgotten. We can also think of those threads as part of a larger tapestry, woven into a larger fabric that tells the story of a larger collective, be it a tribe, an ethnic group, a nation, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, in your own work, and Ahmed, I'll throw this question at you, how do you think about, and I don't think these things are necessarily mutually exclusive, but how do you think about the individual thread as kind of standing on its own versus it being woven into a larger fabric?
America loves a hero and the story of a hero, and maybe the world writ large, but I think here in the US especially. And for me, and I mentioned earlier, kind of somewhat jokingly, becoming the go-to inspiring refugee person was very convenient for a lot of the organizations that were making those invitations. And there's an infrastructure in the US, especially for young, the young changemaker industrial complex. It's real, it's like a thing. And it's, there are parts of it that are positive, parts of it that are not. But oftentimes, and I grew up alongside this, and still growing up alongside it, is that folks attach themselves to movements and organizations for the wrong reasons. And their stories become intertwined with these larger narratives, and institutions of influence get to pick that person because they have gotten all the opportunities over and over again, so they're the greatest speaker or the best speaker. And the collectives that they represent aren't always represented in those talks and those panels and those engagements. And so for me, it was realizing that that was starting to happen and trying to offer an alternative infrastructure for how the stories of displaced young people are told and how they're elevated among kind of institutions that oftentimes are determining the narrative around immigration and the stories of refugees. For us, it was, let's create this collective group of young people that are trained to share their own stories on their own terms. At the very hyper-local level, we work in Syracuse, New York, and in Virginia, and then link that hyper-local work to major institutions like the Met and the Nobel Prize Museum and others, in hopes of not like changing the narrative around how these stories are told necessarily. If that happens, great. But forcing those institutions to think twice about tokenizing those folks over time. And so when I think about that tension between the individual and the collective, I think it's more convenient and it's easier, and it oftentimes can be more powerful to elevate the individual. But I think it's even more powerful to elevate the individual that always is aware of the collectives that made their story possible.
We share very similar work. Whenever you produce a podcast, everyone's always, and you'll get a lot of emails like, hey, can I be on your show? Then we get, producers are like, hey, you need to try to book the Henrietta Lacks family or these really prominent, famous people. And to your point, I have learned in my own experience of consuming media, but also in creating it, that a lot of those stories don't represent the collective. And so for our show, we have focused on telling stories of people that we know or people that we've heard of. We have a story of a then 96-year-old Guyanese woman who lived her whole life in Brooklyn, and through the story of her life, which she knew nothing about genetics or biology, we also tell the story of aging, biologically aging. And so there is this opportunity to hear her story and humanize her as a person while also learning about science and how those two things come together. And so I felt like I was very proud of that. It felt like we were showcasing a collective shared experience, Black lived experience that wasn't traumatic, that wasn't sad, but was just joyful. But we've also, on the flip side of that, have told stories of young people who have gone through very traumatic events. And so we have been trying to figure out how do we represent the collective, but in short, we have found you do that by just talking to people. And some of our guests have never been on the podcast or never spoken publicly, and that also shares light to just how we are as humans. Some of us are better speakers than others, but our stories are not any less important.
I feel like I come from a tradition that's really skeptical of inclusion. Inclusion is kind of the nice way of saying assimilation, at least from an indigenous perspective. And, I think it's worth just pointing out for a moment here that there are over 500 federally recognized tribes here in the United States, over 600 in Canada. If you combine the two countries, it's over 1,200 distinct governments, tribes, First Nations, recognized by the national governments of these countries, and there used to be a lot more. And, our aspiration is not one of inclusion within the body politic. It's not to be part of the expanding story of citizenship and civil rights. Not to say that that's a bad story, but our aspiration is one of reclamation of our right to self-determine, of our land, our culture, our governance systems, which, quite frankly, this country is about to celebrate its 250th, birthday. It's a lot older than 250 years, that our people have been around. And so we are trying, I think, through narrative and through movement and all these other things, to take those things back. And I think from my perspective as a storyteller, my question is often, how can my work be part of that? And what does that look like, creatively and artistically in the way that I approach the stories I tell? So the book that I wrote, for example, We Survived the Night, it's a nonfiction book, but it's done in the style and tradition of the coyote story, which is, an oral tradition from my own people that has nearly died out, but that is also one of the most significant oral traditions in the history of humanity writ large.
When we hear a story, be it told through dance or film or a podcast or through art, we as an audience share an experience, and the art or the film or the podcast, et cetera, are part of that experience, and in some ways we become co-owners of that experience. I mean, that's some of the beauty of art. All of us here got to share the experience of Mythili and her colleagues' incredible performance, but that sharing, to me, implies some ownership, and ownership comes with responsibility. So I wonder if we can think about, as an audience, all of you are producers of stories and narrative, but let's think about the audience a little bit. What's our responsibility once we've heard the story, witnessed the story?
You know, you brought up the performance, and so I'll go back to the performance tradition that I'm a part of, the powwow. You know, part of what's interesting about the powwow is that it comes from older dance societies of the hunt and the war, but that it was actually modernized and spread through the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, which gave Native people the opportunity to, you know, continue to participate in our culture, but for a very different kind of venue. You know, these were audiences who came to watch, you know, the cowboys and the Indians square off again in sort of a, you know, staged type performance. And so I think it's it's interesting for me to think about the ways that, you know, the intention of the people who might be putting on a performance, who might be dancing, singing, etc., are often quite different in, you know, disparate power relationships from the audience that has come to consume that thing. And yet, that very unequal circumstance can also still be a way in which you can Trojan horse your culture and the things that you want to survive into the future, which I think is something that Indigenous peoples across many different contexts have done in numerous ways.
Yeah, I was just going to say from my own experience in developing the podcast, we at one point were working with Spotify, and I was told that we needed to explain certain cultural things that we talk about on the podcast. And my producers and I were like, no, we're not here to explain. I think what it brought to light to me that even being an audience member, sometimes when you are taking in a story, there is an urge to want to understand what the performer's view and perspective is. And it was for the first time that I realized, as a consumer of art, I have never appreciated the freedom in developing my own personal view and experience of it and my own take of the story. And so through that experience, I feel like as an audience member, especially when you're engaging with art that you may not be familiar with, that may not be a part of your culture, it's a really, 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 it's a place of privilege to be able to witness it, but it's also a place of privilege to be able to interpret it on your own terms, and then a place of opportunity to be able to learn from the performance and dig a little bit deeper. And I don't know, after tonight, I'm truly inspired.
Yeah, I think the audience question is one we're wrestling with now. I think for the last decade or so, we've been focusing on activating these leaders and their stories, and they've done amazing work. They've produced hundreds of poems, photographs, videos that have been activated locally and nationally and internationally. And the question we have now is, what does it look like to make this work accessible across the world? Is it a creative library that focuses on the creativity of refugee youth? Is it something else? Is it the time to publish a directory, of immigrant work? It is the time, but also there are new considerations around safety and other things. So I think it's an open question for us, but I think for a long time, we tried to do both the activation and the production and the audience piece, and I think it's difficult to do both at the same time really well. And it's a question of resources and capacity too. So it comes down to the goal. Are you trying to change someone's mind? Are you trying to give someone the tools so that they can go out there and change the minds of other people?
I wonder how you think about the value of the storytelling that you facilitate among the refugee youth or people in general to a future generation that may be around, long after we're gone, and how they'll consume these stories and the legacies.
You can't plan around that long term necessarily. I think if it's a byproduct that happens over time, that's great. The future audience is an important one, and maybe that's where the archive comes in. I think part of it is like the logistical question of how can you make this work accessible. digitally and physically, but also how do you invest in the leadership capacity of folks that they can carry the work forward?
I know for me, in developing the show and the work that I've done, one of the biggest things that I've learned is that I can be my authentic self in science. The way that we think about it on the show is how can we make science culturally attuned? How can the next generation not be turned away from science just because of the communication and vocabulary or the fact that it's in English? How can we make it more accessible? And so I hope that the new generation can think about, well, my goal, what I think is one of the things that can happen is that this new generation can be able to be their authentic selves and bring in culture into science. And that's the thing that we're trying to do.
You know, in my work, I try to work from the premise that Indigenous peoples have something unique to offer the world. The entire project of colonization was, of course, based on the idea that our people were savage, backwards, and needed to die off, and that was progress. And I think it's only right for me to be part of the project of saying that exactly the opposite of that is true. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which Indigenous peoples have much to offer to a world with some big questions hanging over it. Environmental questions. You know, I'm a writer. The big thing in publishing is the transition to orality. Our cultures are oral. You know, there's a world out there that's searching for meaning. Our people know how to make meaning. There's a world out there where people are struggling to find connection. You know, I got like hundreds of cousins across the West Coast in the province of British Columbia. And, you know, that last one, I guess I'll end on because, you know, next month I'm actually going to become a dad. So, you know, the way in which this manifests in my own life is like, what is my responsibility, not just like, you know, as a talking head on a stage or whatever, to pass these things on, but like literally, how can I, through fatherhood, you know, carry these things forward?
Funding for this program was provided by the Stanford Institute for Advancing Just Societies.